Ever walk by like a really cherry classic car and think, man, they don't make them like they used to? It's funny though, right?
Yeah.
Like something that might have been so normal to see decades ago, like picture a Romanian Dacia 1300 just cruising down the street.
Yeah.
Now, that's a head turner. Makes you wonder what changes, you know? Like, is it us or
I
there's the
thought
car?
so.
We've got a stack of articles and notes about vintage cars here. And
Yeah.
let's be real, a vintage car rally in Timisoara, Romania, that's got to be like peak cool.
So that's what we're diving into today. Have you ever noticed that feeling?
Yeah.
Where something old, like, all of a sudden it's cool again.
Yeah.
It's like you stumble across your grandma's old record collection, and now, out of nowhere, it's the soundtrack to your life.
What's interesting is I think our sense of value, it's often like totally ties to time and place, right?
Totally.
Think about it, the Dacia, right? Like in the 70s and 80s,
Yeah.
that was everyday transportation for people in Romania. But today,
Yeah.
it's a piece of history. It's a connection to the past.
Cool. It's a unique aesthetic. Like, even the fact that this car rally, the one we were talking about, took place in Piaia Unirii,
Right.
that's a square that's like steeped in history, right?
Right.
And that wasn't just like a logistical thing, right?
Yeah.
Like they could have held it anywhere.
Right, yeah.
But it just amplifies that feeling of heritage, you know?
It's true, yeah. It really makes you wonder, like, what other cars from that time, maybe ones that we don't even think of as, like, quote-unquote classics now? you know? What's going to capture people's imaginations down the line?
Right.
I don't know. It's like walking into, what is it, like an antique shop?
Yeah, yeah.
And you find something, you're like, oh, this is cool. You just know. It's like a hidden gem kind of thing.
Absolutely. And like even if you take, for example, just like design elements,
Right.
right? Like a lot of the cars from the 50s to the 80s,
Yeah.
they had these like bold lines, there was so much chrome. It reflected like a completely different era of design, you know what I mean?
Totally.
And so those things might have been commonplace back then, but today it's like, whoa, it's nostalgia. Like that longing for a bygone era. And I think this is where like the psychology of collecting comes in too. It's not just the object, it's the feelings it evokes in you, the memories, all that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we've gone from valuing practicality and fuel efficiency to like rediscovering the beauty of craftsmanship, that allure of a bygone era,
Yeah.
you know. And it's not even just cars.
Right.
What about like just stuff from our lives today that will be super sought after by like, you know, future generations?
It's a great question. It really is. Like, imagine someone, decades from now, they find a smartphone.
Right.
We take those for granted, but they might look at it and be like, whoa, look at the design,
Yeah.
look at the technology. Like, this captured a moment in time.
Totally.
Right.
Man.
And it's the same thing, just like those vintage car people, right?
Yeah.
In Timisoara, they're preserving automotive history, and we're all, without realizing it, like curating the stuff of the future.
That is so cool to think about. So, all right, so if there's one thing to take away from this whole deep dive, it's that value. Whether it's a vintage car, a record, even a smartphone, it changes. you know?
It's fluid, yeah.
Yeah, it's this weird dance between time and perception, and maybe a little bit of nostalgia.
Yeah, for sure.
What if we, what if we started looking at all stuff around us, but with that lens, you know? What if we look at it like future generations might?
Right.
What hidden gems are right in front of us waiting to be discovered, I guess?
It makes you think.
It does. It really does.
We're diving into Dacia, the Romanian car manufacturer that went from, let's just say, humble beginnings to a global player. And this all came from a listener request to unpack how that happened.
It's a really good question. How does a brand born out of necessity in communist Romania become a byword for affordable reliability worldwide? It's not exactly a typical story.
Right, so we're going back in time to set the scene. Picture the 1960s Romania under communist rule. Consumer goods are scarce, and a national car industry isn't exactly a top priority. Or is it? I mean, the articles we have here tell a different story.
Yeah, for many countries during that time, especially those under communist regimes, a domestic car industry wasn't just about the cars. It was a powerful symbol. It showed national pride and a way to project progress and self-sufficiency.
Okay, that makes sense. But the articles I read also said that Renault, who we associate with Dacia now, wasn't even Romania's first choice. Apparently, they considered offers from Peugeot, Fiat, even Alfa Romeo. Can you imagine a world with Romanian-built Alfa Romeos? What made Renault stand out in the end?
Strategy played a huge part. Renault proposed the Renault 12, which this wasn't even in production yet.
Wow, so they were thinking ahead.
Exactly. Romania wasn't looking for a temporary solution. They wanted a car model that would get into production quickly. The Renault 12 fit that need.
And they didn't mess around getting started. The Dacia factory in Calabaya was built incredibly fast. Only took 1 year from 1967 to 1968. That's like lightning speed.
Yeah, that speed really shows how dedicated the government was to this project in a system like communist Romania. Decisions, especially for important projects like this, could be made and implemented very fast.
So what was the first car they produced?
The Dacia 1100 is basically a rebranded Renault 8, just a temporary car until the Renault 12 was ready for production.
Makes sense.
And yet they still made more than 37,000 Dacia 1100s. That's more than just a temporary car. It shows that there was a big demand, even if it was just a placeholder.
Interesting. But then things completely changed when they came out with the Dacia 1300 based on that Renault 12. This wasn't just any car, this became the car to have in Romania, almost like a cultural icon.
It is amazing how connected products can become to a nation's identity. We see this all the time with cars. They represent things like freedom and aspiration, and for Dacia, it gave people a real sense of national pride. People weren't just driving them, they were experiencing a piece of Romania.
Yeah, the public loved that Dacia 1300. It was seen as reliable and practical. But as we got to the 1980s, things weren't so easy in Romania or a lot of the Eastern Bloc.
Right, the economy was really starting to affect things.
Yeah.
Articles mentioned things like shortages, rationing, just the general feeling of uncertainty. How did that impact Dacia? It definitely did.
Yeah.
What happened with Dacia during this time is similar to what a lot of the Eastern Bloc dealt with. Imagine trying to keep a car factory running when the whole economy was struggling. It shows how resilient Dacia was, that they didn't just keep making cars, they even came up with new ideas.
And that's when they introduced the Dacia 1302, the utility vehicle based on the 1300. I was surprised to read that it was actually really popular in South America, of all places. That seems random, right there.
It really shows how adaptable Dacia was and how practical the 1302 was. South America back then was a developing market. They needed vehicles that were tough, affordable, and could handle difficult conditions. The 1302 was a real workhorse. It wasn't fancy or luxurious, but it got the job done.
So Dacia was dealing with these economic problems in Romania while also selling cars in unexpected places. What a tough position to be in. Then, of course, we have the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. That was a huge turning point for Romania, and it seems like for Dacia too. Since they released the Dacia 1325 Libertas,
It makes sense that they named it Liberta, which means freedom in Romanian. Dacia wanted to show that they were on board with the changes happening in the country. The car itself was basically an updated 1310. Nothing revolutionary. But that name said it all. It captured the spirit of what was going on at the time.
it's really something how brands and products can become so connected to historical events.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's about understanding what's going on in society and becoming more than just a product.
And through all this, Dacia was still producing a ton of vehicles, even with that huge change to a market economy. The articles talked about their production numbers, and it's pretty amazing.
This is where it gets really interesting. In the 1980s, they were making around 72,000 cars every year with about 30,000 employees. In the 2000s, they were making 4 times that number with way fewer workers. That shows you how much more efficient they had to become and how production was streamlined.
Wow, that is a huge jump. They really changed how they did things. But even with all that success, they wanted to create their own identity. The Dacia Nova, which they said was designed completely by Romanian engineers, is a perfect example. So they're finding their way in this new world, and then 1999 happens, another big year for Dacia privatization, and Renault buys them. That must have changed everything.
That was a huge, but not a total surprise. This is what a lot of the big car companies were doing back then, buying smaller brands, especially ones that were already popular in certain places. It's all about growing without starting from zero.
And Renault saw something in Dacia for sure. They made them the brand for those no-frills, affordable cars, especially in places where car ownership was really taking off. Smart move, if you ask me. They were playing to Dacia's strengths.
Exactly. They were smart to use what was already working. Dacia already had that image of being reliable and easy on the wallet. Renault just turned up the volume.
Yeah, and it worked. But it was the end of an era when they finally stopped making the Dacia 1300 in 2004. That's over 35 years on the road. What a trooper. Seriously. You almost never see a car model last that long. It says a lot about the 1300, though. How well it worked, how simple it was, how it just kept going for people no matter what.
It really shows you how good the design was. But things change, and Dacia had to change too. We saw the Supernova, the Silenza, all kinds of newer models, but they stuck with what worked. Affordable and practical.
It makes you think back to how we started this whole deep dive. We wanted to know how a brand that basically had to exist in a closed-off system could make it in a global market that's full of competition.
And what do you think? What's the answer?
I think Dacia's story gives us a pretty clear answer. It's a big yes. They didn't just survive. They did great because they adapted, they came up with new ideas, and they stayed true to who they were. It's a story about toughness, about creativity, and about making smart choices. It really makes you wonder what's next for Dacia, especially now with electric cars becoming so popular. Can they keep things affordable when the whole industry is changing so fast? Definitely something to watch. But for now, that's the end of our Dacia deep dive. We had a blast going back in time with you. Until next time, keep on cruising. Ever get that feeling, where a brand just like totally owns a certain image?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we're doing a deep dive on your notes about Mercedes,
Okay, cool.
specifically from the 1980s, right? And you pointed out something really, really interesting about how Mercedes kind of navigated this tricky time. So get ready to unlock some serious car girl knowledge, because this is Mercedes, but maybe not as you expect.
Let's just say that sometimes the quietest engines, well, they tell the loudest stories.
I like that. Okay, so you highlighted this thing about Mercedes having reliable diesel but underpowered cars in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And like anyone who knows anything about Mercedes knows that doesn't exactly sound like their typical, high performance rep.
Yeah.
It's kind of like it's like saying a cheetah is known for its leisurely stroll. It just doesn't track.
Right. Well, what's fascinating here is that this little note that we have here kind of opens a window into this really pivotal moment in automotive history. Picture this. It's the 1970s.
Okay.
Oil crisis hits.
Right. Big one.
Fuel efficiency. Yes,
Okay.
that's like the name of the game, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Mercedes, known for those powerful engines,
Yeah.
had to make a choice.
Interesting. So they leaned into reliability, but in the diesel market.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of a bold move, isn't it? It's like, forget horsepower, we're selling you peace of mind at the pump.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And diesel back then, I mean, it wasn't associated with luxury.
No, not at all.
You pictured like a rumbling truck,
For sure.
not a sleek sedan.
Right.
So, Mercedes was walking this really interesting tightrope, right? They had to uphold this image of prestige, this luxury brand,
Of course.
but also appeal to this, now very cost-conscious consumer.
Yeah. Gas was not cheap. I mean, you hit on something really fascinating here with this whole underpowered thing. Like it wasn't just some quirk.
Right.
This reflected this huge shift in like what people valued in a car.
Exactly.
But so, like, what does that tell us about Mercedes today? Like, how does that play out?
Well, I think it really speaks volumes about their ability to adapt as a brand.
Okay.
They could have just said, well, we're Mercedes, we make powerful cars.
Right.
We're sticking with gas guzzlers,
Yeah.
But they didn't do that. They pivoted. And that decision, I think it really has echoed through the decades, right?
Wow.
Think about it. Think about the efficient hybrids the electrics Mercedes is known for now. You could easily argue that those 1980s diesels were kind of like this early step, on this path they're on now.
It's like looking at Mercedes through a whole new lens.
It really is, yeah.
I mean, this seemingly simple note about reliable but underpowered, you just unlocked this like secret level of car history for me.
It makes you wonder, though, like those 1980s diesels, would those be considered cool now? I mean, they got that vintage vibe.
It's funny how perception shifts, right?
Really?
Like what was once considered just purely utilitarian.
Now can be desirable. That alone tells you how much the whole automotive world, even just our relationship with cars,
Yeah.
has completely changed.
That's a good point. Talk about a deep dive. Right? It's incredible how a little context can completely, reframe how you see a brand like Mercedes.
Totally.
It really makes you appreciate the long game.
For sure.
Like decisions made decades ago still affecting what we see on the roads today.
Absolutely.
Okay, folks, next time you see a Mercedes, new or old, think about the journey, right?
Yeah. Think about the journey.
Until our next deep dive, keep those engines running and those observations coming.
That's
Ever notice how some brands just, have that thing, that look? You see it, you instantly know what it is.
Oh, absolutely. Like that coffee shop logo or that
Yeah.
tech company's like minimalist thing they've got going on.
Yeah. And we're diving into a decade that was all about that. The 1980s. Big hair, big shoulder pads, and in the car world, bold design.
Totally.
We're talking Mercedes and BMW, two German powerhouses, each with their own design language.
Right. And both going for that top spot. but in such different ways. It's like two totally different philosophies of cool,
Okay, so let's break it down. Mercedes, already a byword for luxury.
Oh yeah, Mercedes was the status symbol.
So how do they play that hand in the design department in the 80s?
Well, they really lean into the whole legacy thing. It's Mercedes, right? They don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Or the hood ornament, because that star on the hood, that's staying put front and center.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That star was, well, it was huge, right?
Oh.
But it also meant something more in Germany back then, post-war Germany. People who had been through tough times buying these cars.
It was a statement.
Huge statement. It was about where Germany was going. Recovery, ambition, success, yeah. It resonated on this whole other level.
Okay, so you've got Mercedes owning their history, that classic luxury vibe.
Right.
And then on the other side of the Autobahn, you've got BMW going in a totally different direction.
Yeah, totally different vibe.
Our sources call it the shark front.
Small laugh.
And I gotta admit, I thought, okay, what does that even look like? Paint me a picture here. What is a shark front?
All right. So picture the BMW 6 Series, right? From the 80s. That long hood sloping down aggressively.
Okay.
Almost like it's about to pounce. Like a shark's nose. See, they were going for sleek, predatory, those twin kidney grills. They weren't just there to look cool. They were angled to give you this impression of forward motion.
Yeah, like it's moving fast, even when it's standing still.
Exactly.
I see it. It's aggressive, kind of hungry looking.
Absolutely.
So was BMW trying to beat Mercedes at their own game? Or were they after a totally different kind of driver?
That's the big question.
Right.
Because by going with this aggressive, almost, in-your-face design language, they were definitely saying something different than Mercedes. It wasn't about stately elegance. This was about performance, agility.
Instead of an edge?
Yeah. A touch of rebellion, maybe. Not necessarily better, just different.
Okay, so we've got classic elegance versus modern sportiness. But what's interesting is that both brands were tapping into this idea of, identity, making a statement.
Totally.
I mean, it was the 80s, boom times, and your car, it was a reflection of you, your success, your personality.
Absolutely.
Big statement. Makes you wonder, are car designs today as distinctive? I mean, look around.
That's a good question. Have things gotten a bit, homogenous?
It's a good question, and I think that's something for our listeners to ponder. What single design element, if you had to pick one, would you say defines our era? Hit us up on social media. Let us know what you think.
Buckle up, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive. Every now and then it's fun to take a little trip down memory lane.
Oh, absolutely. I'm all for it.
So today we're going to hop into our metaphorical time machine and zoom back to the 1980s.
The 80s, huh? Big hair, leg warmers, and synthesizers galore.
You got it. But we're not here to talk about the music or the fashion, although tempting. We're going deep, deep, deep into the world of car safety back then.
And trust me, it's a whole different world from what we're used to now.
Yeah, that's for sure. Like, what we consider standard safety features now were practically non-existent back then, or at best just starting to emerge. Should be an interesting deep dive.
It really is. Okay, so picture this. You're cruising down the highway in your brand new, totally rad 80s car. What safety features are you rocking, besides that sweet cassette player?
Well, you're definitely rocking that cassette player, that's for sure. But in terms of safety features, based on all the research we've done, it looks like your main line of defense is, your seatbelt.
Seriously.
That's it.
Pretty much. Seatbelts and, believe it or not, crumple zones.
Crumple zones. Okay, gotta admit, those don't sound super reassuring.
Well, they're actually pretty important. Basically, these zones are designed into the car's frame to crumple upon impact. That crumpling action, as wild as it sounds, helps absorb some of the energy from a crash.
Huh. That's actually kind of smart. So the car takes the hit instead of the passengers.
Exactly. Of course, it's not as sophisticated as modern crumple zones, but it was a step in the right direction.
Wow. Talk about a blast from the past. No anti-lock brakes, no electronic stability control. Can you imagine? Driving back then must have been a real adventure, especially in, slippery conditions.
It really was a different era. Back then, the focus was more on passive safety features like those crumple zones and seatbelts rather than the active safety features we rely on today, like think, traction control, and lane departure warnings, all those things that help prevent accidents in the first place.
It's amazing how much things have changed. Speaking of changes, I came across something pretty interesting in my research for this deep dive. It turns out that German cars were actually made in Germany back then. Can you believe that?
Huh, that's right. The globalized auto industry we know today, with parts and cars being made all over the world, that was still kind of getting its start in the 80s.
It's pretty wild to think about how interconnected things are now. We don't even think twice about where our cars are made anymore.
Right. We're so used to globalization that we don't realize it was a gradual process.
It really goes to show how much the industry has evolved, just like those safety features we were talking about. So given that cars in the 80s lacked a lot of the safety features we consider standard today, would you say it was just a riskier time to be on the road?
Well, it's not quite that black and white. While it's true that cars in the 80s didn't have all the bells and whistles we have today, the 80s were also a time of incredible progress in car safety. This was when things like airbags started becoming more common and child safety seat laws came into effect. Plus, organizations like the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, they started conducting standardized crash tests and giving cars safety ratings.
Ah, so it's like the 80s were a turning point where people started taking car safety more seriously, even if the tech wasn't quite there yet.
Exactly. It was a time of growing awareness and a big push for safer vehicles.
So to sum it up, while cruising in your totally awesome 80s car might sound fun, it definitely wouldn't have been as safe as hitting the road today.
Definitely not. It's amazing how far we've come.
It really makes you think about what's next. What will be the seat belts or crumple zones of the future? What's going to revolutionize car safety in the next decade?
That's a great question. I mean, self-driving cars are already starting to become a reality. Who knows what amazing safety features we'll have in the future?
You got that right. Well, on that note, we're out of time for today's deep dive. Thanks for taking this trip back to the 80s with us, everybody, and be sure to check back next time for another exciting deep dive.
Ever try cramming yourself into one of those tiny 80s cars?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It's I swear I practically need to unfold myself afterward. It's wild how much bigger cars have gotten.
Right.
And today we're going to take a deep dive into why that is.
Okay.
We've got a snippet of text here from, get this, a Romanian text.
Ooh, fancy.
Yeah, I know, right? Apparently, even Romanians are amazed by how much cars have grown.
It's a global phenomenon.
Totally. So this Romanian text, basically it compares cars from the 80s to those sleek, modern machines you see cruising around today. And the difference is, well, striking to say the least.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to miss.
Right. The text even says that someone from the 80s would be totally mind blown by the sheer spaciousness of a modern car.
I could see that, like stepping into a different world practically.
Right, they'd be all where'd they get all this extra space? It's crazy. And, the text throws out a couple of interesting ideas as to why this might be.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hit me.
So one of the things they mention is the cost of materials back in the day.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Wasn't metal super expensive back then?
Exactly. And on top of that, remember those crazy oil crises in the 70s and 80s? Gas prices were through the roof.
Ugh, yeah. Tell me about it. I wasn't even born yet, and I can still feel the pain. Smaller cars were just way more practical.
Exactly. Fuel efficiency was the name of the game.
Yep.
So it kind of makes sense that cars back then were, well, a bit more, shall we say, compact.
Yeah, compact. That's a polite way to put it.
Right. But then there's this other idea that the text throws out there, and I gotta admit, this one made me scratch my head a bit.
Okay, lay it on me.
What if, and hear me out on this one, what if people were just smaller back then?
You mean actually small?
Yeah, maybe the average person was just shorter, so they didn't need as much space in their vehicles?
I mean, I don't know about that. That seems like a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I know. It sounds kind of out there.
It's an interesting thought, though. I'll give you that.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how design needs to take into account the dimensions of the people who are actually going to be using the thing,
Totally. But even if people were a bit shorter back then, it probably wasn't the main reason why cars transformed into, these land yachts we have today.
Yeah, probably not. There's probably a whole other factor at play here.
Exactly. And it's actually something our Romanian friends didn't even mention: safety.
Right. Safety regulations. Those have come a long way.
Totally. It's imagine trying to explain a crumple zone to someone in the 80s.
Right. Yeah, we deliberately designed the car to crumple in a crash. Don't worry, it's for your own good.
Seriously. But those crumple zones, they're lifesavers. They absorb all that impact energy, so the people inside are way more likely to walk away from an accident.
And to have a crumple zone that actually works, you need space.
Right. Hence the bigger cars.
Exactly. And it's not just the crumple zones. I mean, think about all the other safety features that are standard in cars these days. airbags everywhere, side impact bars in the doors, those massive bumpers, all that stuff adds up.
For sure. I mean, remember when seatbelts were like optional?
It's crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, the point is this push for, making cars safer, it's a huge reason why cars are so much bigger these days.
Totally. So we've got this whole mix of factors at play here, right? The cost of materials, the need for fuel efficiency, this whole safety revolution. It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it.
It is. I mean, it just shows how a seemingly simple thing like the size of a car is actually like this window into all these complex forces that are shaping, well, everything around us.
Right. It's like car size is a reflection of our values, our technology, our like everything.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, what will cars look like in the future?
Right. Like, will we all be zipping around in those tiny little electric pods, or like, will some other crazy technological advancement come along and completely change the game?
Yeah. Who knows? It's an exciting time to be alive, that's for sure.
It really is. Well, on that note, we're going to have to wrap things up for today. But seriously, keep those why questions coming, listeners.
They're the best kind of questions.
They really are. Until next time, stay curious.
See you later.
Se face foraj doar în jos, se face pe suprafață. Kevin! Ai văzut-o? Astea nu știam ce treacă la mine pe roată. Download-ul.
Da, sigur, sigur.
Era una din locul ăla, dacă ți l-ai luat.
Vede pe el.
Nu văd schema. Și la pe primul care.
Bine, gata, fă de